Welcome to the new Transatlantic Cable, a tripartite civil engineering history webinar series. The webinars are coordinated by the History and Heritage Committee of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National History Committee of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, and the Panel for Historical Engineering Works of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Today's installment, recorded on March 26, 2025, features Richard Fish on historical bridge failures. The host is Kevin Baskin.
Hello and welcome. My name is Kevin Baskin, and I'm a member of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering's National History Committee. I'm a retired bridge engineer, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's presentation on historical bridge failures. This slide shows a map of the 1858 transatlantic submarine cable route from the UK to North America. The reason for showing this slide is that today's presentation is part of a new connection across the Atlantic in the form of the tripartite New Transatlantic Cable Civil Engineering History webinar series, jointly established by the ASCE, CSCE, and ICE. We have a busy 1 hour plan today. The ASCE, CSCE, and ICE are learned societies created to develop and maintain high standards of civil engineering practice. The intent of the tripartite New Transatlantic Cable History webinars is to enhance interaction between the societies and their members and recognize that civil engineering history crosses international boundaries. The talks are to be on topics that involve at least two of the participating societies. It's now my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Richard Fish. Richard is an independent consultant concentrating on long-span bridges and bridge asset management with clients in the UK and internationally. The first portion of his career in the public sector concentrated primarily on bridge design, construction, and maintenance. His interest in bridge collapses has grown over the years, along with a recognition of the responsibility that bridge engineering sector and decision makers have to carry. He's now widely recognized as one of the UK's authorities on bridge collapses. He's a long-time active member and past chair of the UK Bridges Board. And I'll now pass the presentation over to Richard.
Thanks, Kevin, very much for that introduction. And before I start, I just wanted to emphasize the fact that bridge collapses are absolute tragedies for individuals and families and communities. So whilst we might be focusing today on the engineering and some of the numbers, I think we need to have that in the back of my head. And if I have overlooked that element of it, I do apologize. I've taken most of my examples from the three countries, Canada, the USA, and the UK. There will be some which I've missed, but please forgive me for that as well. But there are some of them which are worthy of a webinar in their own right, and that may be something which the tripartite transatlantic cable might want to consider in the future. So as Kevin mentioned, my interest has been around for a while, but it was probably triggered by the collapse of this bridge. This is the I-35W interstate highway bridge over the Mississippi in Minneapolis, which collapsed in 2007. And that was one of the times when I was the chair of the UK Bridges Board. And I had various journalists phone me up and saying, well, surely that couldn't happen in the UK, could it? And I had to say, well, actually, yes, it could. So my interest sort of grew out of that. And eventually it came to what is now a bit of a commercial break, because I've just written a book, which is probably pulling together all the stuff that's been in my head over the last few years. This book doesn't just concentrate on collapses. It looks back at collapses and then looks forward to say what we should be doing. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing this evening. So just in terms of the content, go a little bit why failures happen, 200 years of collapses, and a few statistics and trends. Then what can we do about it? And lastly, drawing some conclusions. So why failures happen? It's seldom just one reason, but you can always make mistakes. So this is the life cycle of a bridge: design, construction, maintenance, management, and operation. Errors in any of those can be one of the reasons, or several of the reasons, why a collapse can occur. There are also other factors, environmental, more so these days with some of the issues around climate change. I've put in an overstretching of engineering understanding, and I think that goes on all the time. So there will be some examples I'm going to discuss this evening, which actually show that we were pushing the boundaries a little too hard. There's also what I call unexpected material deficiency. That's where you sort of expect a material to behave the way it's designed to do, but it doesn't. And typically in the UK, we've had various issues with concrete and alkali silica reaction, which has actually led to various structures having to be replaced before they could be safely used. And lastly, force majeure, which is basically war or terrorist attacks, and that's always a given. But there is fundamentally another big reason, and that's this one: people. It's usual that there's an individual, a group of people, a culture, something which is leading to these collapses. And this isn't new. John Smeaton, nearly 250 years ago, certainly known in the UK as the father of civil engineering. You can read his quote, but he says the hardest thing to get right is the animal part of the machinery. And that's his view that, yeah, it's the people. This is Sir Alec Merrison, and this followed the spate of box girder collapses in UK in 1970. And again, doesn't mince his words. He talks about stupidity, carelessness, or incompetence. And then lastly, this guy, Trevor Pletz, who was a chemical engineer, and its chemical engineering sector have more than their fair share of disasters. And he was a keen investigator as to why that should happen. But he just says people saying that most accidents were due to human error, not very helpful, a bit like saying that falls are due to gravity. Okay, let's look at 200 years of collapses. So having said 200 years, I thought I'd go back to 1825, and I wasn't able to find a collapse anywhere in our three countries, but I did find this one, which is the Saal Bridge in a place called Neinberg in Germany. And it was thought to be one of the first stayed bridges. It wasn't cable stayed, these are chains holding it up. So these are two separate structures, completely isolated. And in the middle here, you've got a double bascule arrangement, in theory, to allow tall-masted ships to pass through. I have to say that the navigation would have to be pretty accurate for that to happen. So it was opened in September 1825. Just 3 months later, there was a large crowd gathering on the bridge. There was a local dignitary staying nearby, and if they all leant against one parapet, they could try and attract his attention, which is exactly what they were trying to do. And sadly, the asymmetric loading and the fact that the bridge was pretty lively anyway led to its collapse, triggered by the stay chains snapping. Again, tragically, 55 people lost their lives. Over to the UK, this is the Broughton Suspension Bridge, which has got some notoriety. A few of you will be thinking, how come he's got a photograph of a bridge taken in 1831 before photography was invented? I have to apologise for that, couldn't find one obviously, but this is the replacement, because in 1831, the bridge collapsed and it was a company of soldiers who were marching over. And of course, marching frequency of about 1 hertz happened to be the natural frequency of the bridge, and it started to vibrate and failed quite catastrophically. Luckily, there were no real casualties because the river was only a metre deep at this point. What it did lead to was this sign, which you see on a lot of UK bridges, is that all troops must break step when marching over the bridge. Another suspension bridge, this is in Great Yarmouth, also in UK, and this is a real tragic instance. But first of all, in terms of the design, so this span is about 26 metres. It was designed as a 19-metre span, and during construction, they decided to increase it from 19 to 26. But didn't ask the designer if that was going to be a problem. Consequently, the towers weren't raised and the catenary profile was a lot shallower than it should have been, so the tension in the eye bars were much the same. It was also widened in 1844, and the tragedy occurred. There was a circus in the town, and there was something going on in the river below. Huge crowds on the bridge, all against one parapet again, and the eye bars snapped. 79 died in the river below, very sadly, including 55 children. Going on to the River Dee Bridge, this is a part of the Chester to Holyhead Railway, and this was built by Robert Stephenson, who was one of the great Victorian civil engineers of the period. This is a case of pushing the envelope a little bit too far, because this span is about 33 meters, and Stephenson chose to use cast iron beams. Now, you can't cast a 33-meter long beam, and even if you could, you probably couldn't bring it to site. So he split it into three. So there's the three sections of cast iron beam. We've got a splice connection here. Then he's got this rather old wrought iron tie bar arrangement to help take some tension at mid-span. The problem was with the edge beams, so they're a very big bottom flange, as cast iron beams used to have in those days. The edge beams were supporting the transverse members, the transoms, on that bottom flange. So you had this torsional loading, and that caused this failure. So this train had just left Chester Station, and it was the locomotive had just reached the abutment when that edge beam failed and the train was tipped into the river. The issue really was pretty clear that the cast iron had failed. Stephenson expressed this cause or effect argument, and his reputation was untarnished as a result. But he maintained that the train had actually derailed, which caused the beam to fail rather than the beam failing, causing the train to fail. Back to the States and the Wheeling Bridge, this amazing Charles Ellet suspension bridge in West Virginia. And this was actually, in terms of a competition between him and William Roebling, and the bridge was actually destroyed in wind, which was a bit of a precursor for one that we might be looking at a bit later on. But it was told that the deck was undulating in the storm, such that the middle of the deck was getting higher than the tower. So quite a storm, but it shook itself to bits. Eventually rebuilt and actually still in use, which I'm sure a lot of you will know more than I do about that one. Just as a slight diversion onto some US railway bridges in the later part of the 19th century, and some of these are almost embarrassing reasons for the collapses. So Gasconade, there were 35 people died just because a train started to cross the bridge before the bridge had been finished. Basic communication should have sorted that one. Apologies, I'm going to get all these pronunciations wrong, so I'll call it the Soquoit Creek Bridge in New York State, which collapsed and 9 people died just because there happened to be 2 trains on the bridge at the same time. These next two, Springbrook and Wood River, were both casualties of what we call scour, and now, or previously known as washout. Springbrook took 41 lives and Wood River took another 7. And lastly, the Chester Bridge in Massachusetts was having some maintenance quite late in the century, so it's actually wrought iron or steel structure, and some rivets had been removed for carrying out some repairs. But it seems that the railway company wasn't aware of that, so a train tried to cross while the rivets were not in place and led to 14 people being killed. Still in the States, this is the Truesdell Bridge in Dixon, Illinois. This was a pedestrian and a tramway bridge. And this is another case of asymmetric loading, really, because there was a baptism ceremony going on in Rock River in Dixon. And huge crowds had gathered on the bridge to watch this, all again leaning on one side, and the bridge failed. 46 people were killed. Back to the UK and actually Scotland. This is the River Tay Bridge, and apologies for the very blurry slide, but I've put it in because I wanted to just give the impression of the scale of the thing. And it was, at the time, the longest bridge in the country. The problem with it was really that it was far too slender, and in a storm in 28th of December, just after Christmas in 1879, a train was crossing in the middle of a storm, and the main part of the bridge, what they called the high girders, failed. So the bridge had been inspected by a Board of Trade inspector at the time, and he made the remark that he would have liked to observe the behavior of high winds on the bridge when a train was crossing. Quite a prophetic statement. But again, that was the combination of loads. It was probably not really understood what the effect of wind was. And certainly when you've got a train on the bridge, you've got the transverse load on the train adding to it. So it was a very nasty failure. And I think 75 people died in that one. And now in Canada, Point Ellis Bridge in Victoria, in British Columbia. This was presumably because of the name of the place. They were celebrating the birthday of Queen Victoria, and there was lots of things going on. And the tramway company, and this is a tramway bridge, decided that they put on an extra large tram car, so they put their biggest one on, which should hold 60 people. But actually, there were 143 people somehow in this 60 capacity tram car. And of course, the bridge failed with that extra load, and 55 people died. Became a sad memorial for Queen Victoria's future birthdays in Point Ellis. Turning to Quebec, I was still in Canada, obviously, and the famous Quebec Bridge, the only one of the examples this evening which collapsed twice. The first of these was in 1907. Reasons for this is all about sort of lack of professionalism, lack of competence, a lot of complacency. It turns out that the preliminary design calcs hadn't been reviewed when the main structure was being fabricated and the final design taking place. And the structure was therefore had a much heavier dead load. And during construction, the guys on site were watching these steel beams starting to deform and raising questions about it. Lots of toing and throwing and arguing, saying, well, that's how they came to site, and so nothing really happening. But on the 29th of August, 1907, this collapse happened and 75 workers were killed. There was a commission of inquiry, and that singled out 2 engineers specifically, but that inquiry also described the supervision of these works as being loose and inefficient. But construction restarted, but on the 11th of September 1916, just as this middle span was being lifted into position, it failed and dropped into the river. There she is, still standing, and now known as a National Historic Site, I believe. On to probably the most famous or even infamous of collapses, that of Tacoma Narrows. Worth remembering that this was the 3rd longest suspension bridge in the USA and indeed the world at the time. The main span of 3,800 feet, which is 853 meters, I believe. And even before construction had been completed, it was starting to move. When it was opened in July, it became a tourist attraction in its own right. I'm sure you've all heard the nickname it had of Galloping Gertie. And because they were concerned, they installed a movie camera on the toll building to track the undulations and put markers on the lamp columns just to try and sort this out. But on the 7th of November, fairly modest wind speeds, about 40 miles an hour. Not only did the vertical undulations continue, but it also started to rotate torsionally. The torsional movements meant that it was actually in its death throes and the bridge collapsed. What is interesting, you can see from this slide, is that how slender that edge, that's an 8-foot deep, 2.4 meter deep plate girder on each side of the deck. And for a span of that's an aspect ratio about 1 to 400. So there was very, very little stiffness. But that was complicit with the theory at the time, the deflection theory. The outcome of this obviously was a much better understanding of aerodynamics, and especially vortex shedding on the leeward side of bridges such as that. And the legacy of Tacoma is probably one which goes right the way through to modern day suspension bridge design. This Point Pleasant Bridge, sometimes known as the Silver Bridge, is over the Ohio River, built in 1928. It's an odd arrangement of a sort of truss, but the top chord of the truss in the middle here becomes part of the suspension system. So it's a hybrid suspension stroke truss bridge. These aren't cables. Again, these are I-bar chains. And the bridge failed on the 15th of December 67. It was due to an I-bar that failed. Now, in the same year, and we'll come on to this a bit later, the National Transport Safety Board was formed, and this was their first bridge collapse investigation. And they did a very thorough job, and it actually found some fatigue cracks which had been propagating inside the I-bar, completely impossible to inspect, let alone maintain. So this was, again, a bit of an eye-opener as far as fatigue is concerned. But the other outcome from this collapse, it led to nationally adopted bridge inspection standards across the USA. Back to the UK, I mentioned box girders earlier on, and this is box girder collapse at Milford Haven, also known as the Claddaugh Bridge. This was an all-welded construction and used a single cell box, and you can't quite pick it out here, but the webs are inclined, so it's a trapezoidal box section. What was probably not fully appreciated was the transfer of shear loads in the diaphragms and in the webs, and that was the outcome of the Merison report, which I mentioned earlier on. Again, this collapse, as you can see, narrowly missed residential properties below. Nobody was hurt below, but 5 people were killed working on the bridge. Now going to Australia, because this is at the same time the collapse of the Westgate Bridge, which is a story really of lots of different site issues going on, a lot of industrial relations, breakdowns, strikes. But this was a much bigger box girder, and the process for erection was that this is actually in 2 bits. So each side of the box with its cantilever, which is effectively a channel member, was jacked up to the top here of the piers and then slid across, where they tried to bolt it all together, a longitudinal splice. And that caused a lot of problems because the torsional stiffness of the box was absolutely fine, but with 2 channel sections, there was no torsional stiffness at all. So it was very hard to connect this central splice. And the splice itself was that they had to use some concrete kentlage to try and get the bridge to deflect before they could insert some bolts. And then, for whatever reason, there was a decision taken to remove some bolts at mid-span, which led to the collapse. And very sadly, 35 people died in the collapse, either on or below the bridge. Back to the States and the Sunshine Skyway, with reminiscences of the later Francis Scott Key collapse coming out there. So this was the first bridge which was in the States with a ship collision. This is an empty freighter. Now you can see how high it is standing out of the water. As this was approaching with the pilot on board, there was a sudden thunderstorm, and it was pushed into this pier, which you can just make out here, and the whole of this truss section. Obviously, there are 2 bridges. This is the old one, and then they duplicated it a few years later. So the old bridge was completely destroyed. Now, very sadly, traffic continued using the bridge even when after the collapse, because there was no way of letting people know that there's no bridge here. So most of the fatalities, which numbered 35, were in 4 cars and a bus, which drove off the bridge into midair. back in Canada, this is de la Concorde underpass, and it just serves to show that it's not just big bridges that have failed. This is a fairly modest underpass that you'll see on any major highway network. It's about a 35-meter span. The slab that failed there was actually held up by two half joints, and this was actually an issue in terms of how those half joints were built. This was all found out afterwards with the Royal Commission that was established. And the half joints were inspected, and there was various cracks coming out of the entrance, the corner. And there was some concern. So it was inspected in 2002 and was found to be in a good condition. The next time it was inspected, it had gone down to acceptable condition, which is one notch down. And then after that, it had gone back up again to good, but without any intervention. So it just shows the importance of the competency needed for inspections. And then back to the 35W, which is, as I said, was the one that started me on this process. So this is the 1st of August 2007, and 111 vehicles were involved and 13 people died. And the culprit was this gusset plate, which, as you can see, is deformed. And again, the TSB did an absolutely marvelous report on this. And this is actually a photograph without the arrows and the red lines that was taken from an inspection of the bridge well before it collapsed. So there was the problem, but it wasn't spotted and it wasn't acted upon. But it turns out there are other issues as well with original design and some of the shortcomings in operation, because it was widened and it had extra load put on with median barriers and edge barriers. And I'll go into the FRU bridge, which is a case really of a lack of awareness, being almost risk blind as to what was going on. So this structure was lifted into place, then the highway underneath was left open, and it's waiting for its neighbour to come over here. As soon as it had been released from its mobile platform, which put it in place, cracks started to appear, and the cracks grew and grew and grew, and after about a fortnight, they were about 20 millimeters wide, probably enough to stick all your fingers of your hand in. There was no surprise really that on the 15th of March, it had been in place for 19 days. It collapsed and killed one worker and 4 people in cars underneath. And the inquiry, again, the NTSB one into this, looked at the reasons, and the engineer of record, who's the guy who is fundamentally responsible for ensuring that the design is built correctly, is quoted as saying he had repeatedly indicated that the cracks were of no safety concern. Salutary lesson. Lastly, in terms of the examples, back to the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, which coincidentally was exactly 1 year ago today that collapse. And we all have that fresh on memory, the MV Dali, which lost power and triggered the progressive collapse with 6 guys who were working on the bridge who died. What's interesting is that the FSK was built in 1977. One of the outcomes from the Sunshine Skyway collapse in 1980 was that ship protection measures should be designed much better than they had been. Now, whether this was ever retrofitted, I'm sure will come out with the TSB report into this one. What is interesting as well, and you could see possibly from the size of the 2 ships, and I did a little bit of research in this, and it turns out in that time, in the 40 or so years, the size of shipping has grown by a factor of 7. So you're getting ships that are 7 times the size of what they were in the 1980s. Going through to some statistics and trends very quickly. So this is the stats for this century, and I'm not saying these are wholly accurate numbers because it's very hard to get those figures. But I reckon there's been 8 fatal collapses that we know about. There will be some in other countries which we don't, and there's been at least 1,400 fatalities. So I thought I'd compare that with the 2 25-year periods at the end of the 20th century and you can see either way, any way you look at it, there is an upward trend, and that's part of what we should all be concerned with. And this slide shows the bridges that have been built post-war. This actually relates to bridges on our motorway and trunk roads in the UK. And you can see the peak around the 1970s. But you've got this yellow line, which is the profile. And you fast forward that, say, 50 years to where we are about now. And that's the level of investment in rough terms that you should be putting into making sure that our bridges are safe and sound and we don't have any issues. So what can we do about it? Well, firstly, investigation and reporting. I've mentioned the NTSB. In 2017, they did a promotional video marking their 50 years and came up with this strapline, which I think says it all. From tragedy, we draw knowledge to improve the safety of us all. So there's also been, as I've mentioned, as I've gone through, some royal commissions. These are readily available online, easy to find, and quite daunting read, but very valuable. So one into the Westgate Bridge collapse. This was a bespoke one for the Chiogara Bridge in Colombia, which collapsed in 2018 and was actually commissioned by insurance companies and produced by IABSE as an international document. And then this is the document I've mentioned before with the Merison inquiry into the, notice it says method of erection as well as design of steel box girder bridges. So there are some good ones. I'm afraid to say there are some not so good. This is a masonry arch bridge which collapsed in the UK in 2016. And we could only get information on what had been going on there. The bridge owner was reluctant to share for whatever reason. We had to use what is called a freedom of information request to actually see the details. But fundamentally, that again was due to Scarra. But no vehicle on the bridge at the time. So it does beg a lot of questions, perhaps, as in terms of its maintenance and its condition. Turning to engineering ethics in part of our professional responsibilities, and I highly recommend two publications, one by the Institution of Civil Engineers in Plain Sight, which talks about the aftermath of the fire in the Grenfell Tower block in London, and also this one, which is produced by the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Engineering Council. And this looks at the wider engineering sectors, but it emphasizes the importance of engineering ethics. And that's also borne out by the Canadian Iron Ring, which I'm sure everyone will know about on the Canada side of the call, but worth investigating than anybody else. So their mission and vision statements are what's not to like about those. And of course, the other thing is what we must do is continuously learn, both as individuals and as a bridge engineering community. And this is where I like this CIKW, which is sort of the transition from data to information to knowledge to wisdom, something we can apply throughout. Just talk a little bit about risk. This is a quote which related to this bridge, Genoa or Volterra Viaduct collapse in 2018 in Italy. And this was the investigator who was investigating it. And this is what he described as what was the main contributory cause of that collapse, is that risk was totally ignored or at best played down. So following that collapse in Italy, there was a few other ones. So Italy itself decided that there were 300 or more bridges could be unsound. In France, 840 bridges were at risk of collapse. Germany, only 12.5% of bridges were in good condition. And all that sort of is the same sort of scale on that graph I showed earlier on about that movement of the curve to the right. Now in the USA, I apologize because these figures are way out of date now, but at the time, through your National Bridge Database, over 600,000 bridges, average age 42. 1 in 9 of those were structurally deficient, and that's the lower grade of the inspection regime, and then nearly 21,000 fracture critical. And later, the 130,000 defined as being structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. And another stat, which I haven't written down, but in the USA, there's 200 million trips taken over structurally deficient bridges, and that's every day. So how do we look at risk? And this is something which came out of the aerospace sector. And what your track is these precursor events. So there will be things that happen which perhaps lead to minor injuries before you get to fatalities. So those are the things you've got to watch. And I translated that into bridges. So ignore the scale, because obviously there's a huge number in very good condition. But then you might have some general deterioration or other defects that are creeping through. Now, the Institute of Civil Engineers earlier this year published the State of the Nation report, and in that it does refer to bridges, revealed growing disquiet about the continued resilience of the nation's infrastructure network, with bridges causing the most worry. Parts of the network are perhaps not as safe as the public thinks, and some structures should have usage restrictions but don't. So the big question, and this is purely rhetorical because I know what the answer is, we certainly don't have enough budget to maintain our bridges properly. So in conclusion, I will just pose some challenges. This is about our collective bridge management. How good are we at looking after all these hundreds of thousands of bridges around the world? How can we demonstrate that we are competent to do that? And how do we make sure we can drive out complacency? And what's our perspective on risk? This is a quote actually from the Royal Commission into the de la Concorde collapse, and this is from 2007, but it talks about consistent awareness and vigilance. Those of you who heard me speak on this before will know what my next slide is going to be, because it's going to be the quote from Professor Bill Harvey. So any bridge manager worth their salt should be living in a state of constant low-level anxiety. That's a question we've all got to ask ourselves all the time. Right, I think that's me done. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. There's an awful lot for all of us to think about. We maybe have a few minutes for questions and answers. Here's the first question. Your recent examples cite mostly failures in the United States, which I think is probably because we can learn lots from incidents occurring there because of the quality, timeliness, and quality of the NTSB's reports. Do you consider there is a need for a structures accident investigation branch similar to AAIB, MAIB, and RAIB in the United Kingdom?
Yes, the whole point is that, so those of the air accident investigation and marine accident investigation and rail accident investigation, there is nothing that's similar for highway. And like that example that I gave of that arch bridge which collapsed through Skara, if we had a NTSB organization such as we need, then yes, we would earn a lot from that. We are pushing towards it. We are working with there's an organization called CROSS, the Collaborative Reporting of Safer Structures. So a few of us are working with them to try and determine that. But the NTSB sets the bar very high, but that's no reason why other countries shouldn't try and emulate it. The only other country I've found with a very similar organization is in Taiwan. In fact, there is a Taiwan Transportation Safety Board as well, which produces excellent reports in the same vein.
Next question. In what ways do socio-political factors influence the decision-making process during bridge design and construction, and how can engineers navigate these challenges to prioritize safety?
That is always going to be a challenge. Almost every bridge that's built that has its roots somewhere in a political decision. So there is going to be a politician or a series of politicians or a government which has said, right, this is what we're going to do. And then it's always down to money. Sadly, our profession tends to have projects which usually increase in cost. So politicians will always say, I've got to cut the costs, got to cut the costs. And the other element, of course, is that if the more you're spending on new stuff, the less money there is for maintaining the existing. More often than not, it's the existing bridges that are going to bluntly kill people. So much of our investment really needs to switch from building new, in my opinion, to looking after what we've got. And again, it's our ethical responsibility as engineers is to looking after the safety of the travelling public. And I think that's the message we've got to get across to politicians, as well as pointing out the need proper funding for proper bridge management.
Building off of that question, what role does public perception and media coverage play in the aftermath of a bridge collapse, and how can engineers and authorities effectively communicate findings and safety assurances to the public?
That's getting a lot worse in the days of social media. People are always quick to work out that, oh, well, here's the reason, and it goes all over social media, and then the mainstream media get on it, and almost throughout the world, people are looking for someone to blame. Well, first of all, they want the solution to be nice and simple, and then they want to find out whose fault it is and blame them. The public perception and the media perception tends to be one and the same. Looking at it the other way round, a bridge which is standing up and doing its job is usually invisible as far as the public's concerned, travelling public. They either go over it or under it. I know when I drive along with my family, I say, well, look at that bridge, and oh, what bridge is that? So I think we have a completely different perspective and have that probably air of low-level anxiety or need for vigilance to make sure we are looking after what we've got. But it's a bit of a thankless task, really. I think we're not, we take the blame when things go wrong, but we don't necessarily get the credit when 99.9% of the time everything is fine.
Changing the direction a little bit, another comment. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Do you think structural health monitoring using vibration sensors can have a place in structure inspections?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And for me, it's always about scale. So certainly for the bigger bridges, and especially those that are being built or have been built in the last 10, 15 years, where structural health monitoring has been fitted from day one, you get an excellent performance of the bridge. Retrofitting SHM can work, probably not quite as effective. But the scale factor is when you get down to the smaller structures, probably you don't necessarily get the same return on the investment for fitting SHM, but it is a rapidly moving space. And then at least now, as AI is starting to kick in, there may well be opportunities. I'm aware of satellite monitoring, for example, on relatively small bridges, which can detect early signs of movement and deterioration without having to have a whole load of kit on the bridge itself. So I think this is a real watch this space question. But as I say, my personal view is, yeah, it's fine for the medium to big span bridges, but may be a struggle for the smaller ones.
With the growing issues regarding climate change, etc., how can bridges be future-proofed considering a difficulty in predictions or outdated standards related to environmental aspects?
Yeah, another good question. And I think fundamentally it's the biggest issue is going to be around SCARA. What's interesting is that certainly in the UK, our SCARA inspection standard has just been updated. Most collapses, maybe a generalization, but I'm absolutely sure it's true. Most collapses are due to SCARA. That's going to get worse before it gets better. The future proofing, I think, is a challenge for new builds. And I think that's where you've got to almost assess some sort of additional requirement. And it may be in the capacity of a culvert or the span of a bridge, get the foundations out of the waterway. Other issues will apply through climate change, and not least very high temperatures. There's issues been talked around of both overall temperature effects with joints being not adequately sized so that the bridge expands to the extent that it's taking off, closing up. And there's also what's a relatively new thing called thermal shock. It's a very hot day, the bridge is suddenly drenched with a thunderstorm. What's the effect of that? So these are the things which are starting to have to be taken into account.
One final question. I'm not sure, but I thought design problems seem to be the predominant cause of bridge failures highlighted in your presentation. Do you think maintenance problems are underappreciated or underrepresented?
Yeah, maintenance has always been the poor relation, really. And maintenance and deterioration is always progressive. And going back to the political question on this one as well, because and I've had to do it myself, where you've got a problem bridge and you talk to a political master and you say, well, are you going to tell me it's going to fall down tomorrow? And well, no, I can't tell you that. Well, it'll be all right then, won't it? Is it going to fall down next month? Is it going to fall down next year? And that's one of the biggest problems we all face is this, and it's a phrase I absolutely hate, but of deferred maintenance, where you're always putting off what could be done. That Polcevera viaduct in Genoa, they knew there was a problem. There were 3 of those big pylons, and the first one to be built being completely retrofitted with new saddles, new cable stays. So they knew they had to do the other 2, and for whatever reason, the maintenance was deferred, not enough money. So it's a big problem. And that's, again, that little graph I showed, the movement to the right of that curve. I think it's a growing problem which we're all going to have to face.
We've got a lot more questions, but not a lot more time. Again, I would like to just thank you so very much for presenting. We had an excellent turnout here. I think this is the most people we've had ever for one of our tripartite history webinars. I'd just like to let people know that our next presentation is Wednesday, May 7th. Mike Bartlett, the past chair of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering History Committee, is going to do a talk on surveying the United States-Canada international boundary. So finally, just a reminder of our next presentation in May, and thank you all for attending, and have a pleasant couple of months in the meantime.
The new transatlantic cable webinars are coordinated by a tripartite ad hoc committee that includes the individuals listed here. The new transatlantic cable webinars are coordinated by a tripartite ad hoc committee that includes the individuals listed here.